Hi everyone, this is Matthew Jana for Card Runners, and I'm here with SSNL, You're Doing It Wrong, Part 2, Fearing the Re-Raise. So first off, I added this slide after making all the other slides, and I wanted to let you know that I intended to keep this video simple, but as it turns out, I didn't feel I could do an adequate job addressing a simple leak without introducing a more advanced concept, and this concept will be discussed in much more detail throughout the next year. As a result of this, the video starts out reasonably basic, but it gets quite advanced at the end. I tend to try to avoid doing this, but it seemed necessary here. So ideally, I like to have videos that are aimed at like a specific skill level and not be kind of everywhere. But with this video, it seemed like it just wasn't possible to do that. Because of this, I think most players will benefit a lot from watching this video, but there will likely be 10 to 15 minutes of the video that is too difficult or too easy based on your skill level. So if you're already a really good player, you're probably going to find the beginning a little bit too easy. And if you're a relatively new player, you're probably going to find the end really tough. But at the end of the day, I think most people that watch this will still get a lot from it. So what should you expect in the video? In general, the SSNL You're Doing It Wrong series is less technical and more vague than my usual videos. They're kind of videos I just make when I notice a general leak that most SSNL players have that I want to discuss, but it's not a leak that needs like its own theory series. It's basically a series for me to show spots that I think a lot of SSNL and microstake players are struggling with. Today, we're going to be focused on betting and raising with non-nutted hands, even when we know we'll hate getting re-raised. And it's probably the least focused video I've ever made, but it will let me touch on a lot of small spots that don't deserve their own video. So again, ideally, I have like a really focused video when I make an hour-long video, whereas this video has a lot of concepts that are related to one another, so they do belong in one video, but it's not as focused as a lot of other videos are. And then at the end, we introduce a more advanced concept of using a less polarized post-flop ranges that most advanced players should find very useful. So that's the hard part that's going to come at the end. The first part is going to be pretty simple, but at the end, we're going to deal with using less polarized ranges post-flop, which is something that I've never really talked about before, that I think a lot of, the MSNL players are really going to like. And even if you're playing, micro stakes or small stakes, it still will help you understand poker better to get introduced to this concept now. All right, so some poker theory background. From what I've seen, there's a few stages in how people approach playing spots. The first stage is betting a ton and not calling very much. So this strategy is pretty easy to play and was, in my opinion, more or less advocated in super systems. This strategy can definitely beat weak opponents, but calling is much, much more common in a GTO strategy than is recommended by a lot of old poker literature. So one thing I've been talking about a lot in my other videos is when you're betting in position, or if you're raising in position, you reopen up the betting. That's a really big deal, especially against opponents that are capable of taking advantage of that. And then when they see you bet in position, they're capable of check raising aggressively, or they're capable of, three betting on the flop if you're raising too much. So just understand that a GTO strategy advocates calling a lot more. Whereas if you were around for poker several years ago, you'd often hear like pretty bad advice, like raise to see where you're at, or calling is a weak play. And that's just not true. You still see most people recklessly continuation bet and refuse to call in spots where future streets will be tricky. So even though people have kind of moved away from this sort of reckless betting and raising strategy, you still tend to see that on the flop. And that's especially because the flop is just, in my opinion, the hardest street to play. You just went from each player having access from 2 cards to 5 cards. Ranges are super wide. So people tend to just kind of recklessly bet because it's profitable, even when there are more profitable lines. So this strategy is consistent with the if you bet, there's 2 ways to win, because you can win if he folds, or if he calls and you win at showdown from making the best hand. But if you're calling your opponent's bet rather than betting or raising yourself, there's only one way to win, and that's to win at showdown. So that was something that was really stressed a lot of times in older poker literature, how, raising or betting gives you 2 chances to win, but calling just gives you 1. A lot of hands which are profitable bets or raises are more profitable checks or calls. Your brain sucks at distinguishing good from better, but it's pretty good at distinguishing good from bad. So again, this is stuff that I've talked about in other videos, though I'm going to briefly repeat right now, which is people have a really hard time realizing something like if you're the pre-flop raiser, it's more profitable to maybe like check raise a flop set than it is to continuation bet, because continuation betting with a set is so incredibly profitable. So you're not really going to realize you have a leak there. That check raising is better than continuation betting when you flop a set in certain spots because, if you're getting this really good outcome and you're winning a ton of money, you're not usually going to look at that spot for somewhere where you have a leak. But on the other hand, if you're making a bluff that doesn't work enough and you end up losing money with that bluff, you're pretty quickly going to be like, oh, wait a second, I'm making a mistake, and probably be able to plug it. Again, this is, I think, kind of like the old way of thinking, which I want you to sort of get in your head for what people used to kind of advocate a long time ago. And for the most part, it's a pretty effective strategy, especially against fish. So the reason why I'm talking about this stuff now isn't because I think a lot of people are playing this way currently, especially the people that are watching these videos, but I think it's really beneficial to understand how there's kind of been a change in the way people think, especially if you've been around for several years or, even now, a lot of times people will read books or watch videos that were written several years ago, and it's kind of important to understand the strategy that people tended to implement then. Okay, so that was, I think, kind of like the first overall sort of game plan, a very bet-heavy, raise-heavy strategy. Okay, so the second would be polarized ranges. And I've mostly advocated this for the last few years. So rather than recklessly bet, we can use a polarized raising range and depolarized checking and calling range. So again, this is a step that I've kind of mostly advocated in my videos. If you look at like my flop play series or even my older pre-flop series, you'd see this talked about a lot. This allows us to protect checking ranges and allows us to effectively realize the equity of our strong and weak hands. So strong hands can raise for value, and weak hands with very robust equity, like gut shots or 3 to a flush, 3 to a straight, can be played in raising ranges and often outdraw the opponent's calling range. So what a robust equity hand means is, it means if like the hand improves, it's going to beat almost anything in the opponent's range. So if I have a gut shot, or if I have 3 to a flush or 3 to a straight, when I tend to make my strong hands, which will usually, of course, be straights or flushes, but occasionally 3 of a kind, those hands will pretty much beat my opponent's range no matter how strong my opponent's range is. So we raise our really, really strong hands for value usually. Sometimes we'll slow play them. And then we raise our hands that have really robust equity because those hands don't mind making the opponent's range stronger because when they draw out, they'll still make super awesome hands. So when we do this, we can use models to design ratios for bluffing to value raising ratios on different streets. This results in pretty balanced ranges that are pretty easy to make. It's probably close to impossible to defend enough against bets without aggressively bluff raising or calling with a wide range. A polarized raising range makes this possible. So that's one of the big reasons, which is awesome about using polarized ranges, is it lets you bluff raise very aggressively on the flop. It's relatively easy to do. Everything kind of intuitively makes sense, and you sort of just get an overall feel for, how aggressively you should bluff on different board textures, how aggressively you should bluff on the river compared to the flop. And polarized ranges are pretty good at making sure you get to, realize your equity in the right way. You call with hands that don't do well as your opponent's range gets stronger, and then you raise with hands that can still win even if the opponent has a very strong range. So now the next step would be less polarized ranges. And you're seeing a lot of really, really good players talk about this now, and you're seeing a lot of really good players use this strategy, of course, when they're playing. So in most spots, you probably would more accurately describe it just as these ranges just aren't as polarized. I wouldn't call them depolarized ranges. I wouldn't try to use any sort of fancy word to describe it because it's not really going to do a very adequate job in my opinion. It just means we're using a less polarized ranges. Whereas before, maybe we were, raising on the flop with only our nuts and air, and we were calling with everything in the middle. Now we're just not quite that polarized. So when we're doing this, our ranges will still be polarized since strong hands, which are value raises, and weak hands, which are bluffs, retain their equity well and make the most sense to raise. But at the end of the day, all that matters is that we take the most profitable or most plus EV line. So sometimes it's more plus EV to raise with a hand that's not a weak hand with robust equity or a nutted hand. So sometimes it's more profitable to bet or raise with a hand that really doesn't fit the criteria of being in a polarized range. This especially makes sense in context of an already polarized range. So in other words, if I'm check raising mostly nut type or air type hands against you on the flop, you're not going to be 3-betting because 3-betting against a range of only nuts and air is ineffective. It sucks. But this allows me to now start check raising a few hands which hate facing a flop 3-bet since I know you won't re-raise anyways. So again, this third stage in thinking, I would say, is stuff we're going to talk about a lot more at the end of the video, and this is the more complex thing. But all I'm saying is if I'm betting or raising with a range of just nut type and air type hands, no one's ever going to re-raise against me. because my range is so polarized, they have no incentive to re-raise against me. But if people aren't re-raising against me, then I can say, oh, wait a second. If my opponent thinks my range is so polarized here that he's never going to re-raise, now it might be better for me to actually start raising with some hands that would do really, really poorly if my opponent were to re-raise, because even though I'm raising with some hands now that don't want to face a re-raise, my opponent's not going to do it anyways. So it's almost like you've gone from making really, really polarized ranges, realizing if you use super polarized ranges that your opponent won't re-raise, and because of that, that lets you say, aha, now I can actually add in a few hands that aren't all that polarized because my opponent's not going to re-raise against me anyways. Again, this is the more complicated stuff, which is why this video doesn't do the best job of only, catering to really new players or really advanced players. So a lot of the next year will probably deal with the next stage of poker theory, but it's important to just have a vague understanding of it now. All that matters is that we take the most plus EV line, and sometimes that means we bet or raise with a hand that isn't a clear value bet or bluff. So again, especially if you're a new player, just take that from this right now. Absorb that. Sometimes it is best to raise or bet with a hand that really doesn't fit that. Is it a value bet or is it a bluff criteria very well? So you're probably asking yourself, what was the point in all that background information? Well, the point is to try to get you thinking ahead and to start playing with ideas. But what I especially want you to take from this is it's pretty common to bet or raise with hands that don't want to face additional action, since we'll rarely be very strong. At the end of the day, it's just hard to really make nut-type hands and hold them. You just don't have them very often. So when you're betting or raising, even though betting or raising is often the best line, it's rare you want to see your opponent re-raise. Look at it this way. What would I rather have my opponent say when he faces my flop bet? So what would I rather have my opponent, overall, when he takes a line, he's going to be saying one of two things. When he folds, he's kind of like saying, I'm going to fold, since I don't think I can play my hand profitably against your bet in this zero-sum game. So if my opponent folds, he just gives me the pot. Whereas if he raises, he does think he can play his hand profitably against my bet in this zero-sum game. So overall, it's of course always pretty much going to be desirable for my overall range to just immediately win the pot. So when I'm betting, overall I'm hoping my opponent folds. Because when my opponent folds, he just says, you know what? He doesn't think he has a plus EV line, so he mucks. Whereas when my opponent raises, he does think he has a plus EV line, so that usually makes me in a pretty uncomfortable position. Remember, poker is a zero-sum game, so if my opponent thinks he has a profitable line, that, EV, that expected value has to come from somewhere. So it means, the EV of my hand or my range is now lower. So if my opponent thinks he can take a profitable line against my range, that's of course not what I wanted to see. I'd rather have him fold, in which case I just win the pot. So especially the newer players watching this, I want you to mentally prepare yourself to want folds when betting. A lot of times, if you're playing against really weak opposition, you're probably used to maybe if you play at a live casino or if you play super low stakes, you're used to winning most of your money by wanting people to call because people don't fold enough. So you just mostly value bet and you're like, oh man, I hope this fish calls. I hope this fish calls. That is not at all how poker is going to work against reasonable opponents. So mentally prepare yourself to want folds when betting. So all I'm getting at is that overall with our entire range, so not with a specific hand we're holding, but overall with our entire range, we want our opponent to fold, in which case our opponent thinks, he has a hand that's zero EV, rather than, raise, in which case he thinks he has a plus EV hand. So when we bet, folds are good. That's what we want overall with our range. Calls are kind of meh, because then it means our opponent's range usually isn't that good. We're at least going to see additional cards. And, we might just be getting value if our opponent's calling with some weaker hands and he doesn't outdraw us. So calls are okay. And re-raises are bad, because that means our opponent has the strongest hands in his range. So that's not to say we won't want calls or raises with some specific hands when we bet, but in general, we just want our opponent to go away. So again, we're looking at our entire range here, and when we bet, overall with our range, we'd prefer our opponent to fold, whereas of course there's some hands within our range that are going to want folds and others are going to want calls. Sometimes we'll have the nuts. So this doesn't mean our betting range is too weak or our opponent is making a mistake. It means our opponent can have three ranges usually when facing a bet, his raising range, his calling, or his folding range. And obviously his folding range is the weakest range and his EV, and the EV with our range is highest against that range. So again, if you bet into your opponent, what kind of hand would you rather have him have overall with your range? Would you rather have him have his folding range, in which case it means he has a really weak hand because he, folds his weak hands, his calling range, which means he has a medium strength hand, or his raising range, which means he either has, a bluff or a value hand, but overall that's going to be the strongest range. So of course, we're just preferring our opponent folds because, at the end of the day, it's random what hands we get dealt and what hands our opponents get dealt, and we'd prefer him to just tell us, oh, he had a weak hand and he goes away. So what's up is you need to start getting ready to play some aggressive poker and just go Lesai 80% of the time when you face a raise or re-raise. And I just made up that 80%, but you get what I mean. Most of the time, you're not going to want to face a re-raise or a raise, and if you haven't trained yourself to accept this, you're probably taking too passive of lines in some spots. That said, don't recklessly continuation bet. That's not what I'm talking about, as you'll see. And remember, your opponent has hands that belong in one of three ranges, the folding, calling, or raising range. He can't magically make himself have more hands in his raising range. And of course, if he starts putting hands that should be in his folding range into his calling or raising range, then our GTO-ish strategy will crush him. So understand players can only raise so often and remain balanced and be using the right types of hands. So a simple example of this would be like, when I open the button, I usually hate it when my opponents 3-bet from the blinds. But just because I hate facing a 3-bet from them doesn't mean they can start 3-betting like crazy, because then if they try to 3-bet like crazy, they start having to 3-bet hands that don't work well as 3-bet bluffs, and they end up overall losing money to me. So all the time I'll take a line where I'll open on the button, I'll be like, oh man, I hope they just fold, or if they don't fold, I hope they just call, and then I don't get, I get unlucky that in fact, one of them 3-bets me, and I sigh and I end up calling myself, but my opponents can only 3-bet me so much, otherwise they're going to have to start using really, really weak hands, and then they're just going to get crushed against my strategy. So just be aware that even if you don't like facing a certain line from your opponents, they can only take that line so much and, be using the right type of hands. So let's start with a pre-flop example. At anonymous tables, the button opens and we hold King Jack off the big blind. What do I think we should do? Well, now in this case, I think we should 3-bet it. This is a hand that a long time ago, I think almost everyone was calling with it. But now I think most players would agree it's probably a 3-bet. Especially that's true if people are min-raising on the button, which a lot of people do now. So we 3-bet this, and we hope he doesn't 4-bet. So imagine our opponent is game theoretically optimal. Which range are we hoping his hand falls into? So ignore for a second. Again, if you're thinking in terms of polarized ranges, it's probably very tempting to all of a sudden look at this King Jack off and be like, wait a second, are we using polarized or depolarized or whatever range is pre-flop? That's not at all what we're talking about right now. We're just saying we think 3-betting King Jack off is the most profitable line because we don't want to give our opponent a bunch of free flops. King Jack off is still decently okay in a 3-bet pot even when we're out of position. So we 3-bet it. We're re-raising, really hoping our opponent doesn't 4-bet. So sorry, we're raising and we're really hoping our opponent doesn't re-raise by 4-betting. So if we're playing against a GTO opponent, what range are we hoping his hand falls into? So a GTO opponent will always take the optimal line no matter what we do. Of course, we want him to have a hand that's in his weakest range, which is his folding range. Next, if he doesn't have a weak hand that's in his folding range, we'd next prefer him to have a medium strength hand in his calling range. And we least want him to have a hand that's in his strongest range or his re-raising range. So again, he has some hand that's in his pre-flop button opening range. We 3-bet. And we're, of course, going to hope he just has a hand that's in his weakest range. After that, his medium strength range, and we don't want to see him have a hand in his strongest range. Again, this probably seems very simple to some people that are watching this video, and I apologize for that. But it's really important for the new players to not get in their mind, call this King Jack off a value 3-bet. Because then when they value 3-bet, it's going to be very easy for them to have this mistake where they think, well, wait a second, if I'm value 3-betting, then of course I want to be called. Because if I don't want to get action when I'm value 3-betting, why don't I just call pre-flop? That's not how things work. Ideally we still want our opponent to fold because that just means he has, the weakest hand. To make this a little bit clearer, the only hands I think I would really want action from if I were 3-betting from the blinds against a button open would be jacks, queens, kings, aces, ace, king, and ace, queen. If I had to guess. Maybe I'd also want action with king, queen, or ace, jack suited. But for the most part, and I probably want action, maybe I want action from tens. So you can imagine, I'm 3-betting really, really wide ranges from the big blind against the button open, but there's very few of them where I actually want my opponent to call. And there's even fewer that I want my opponent to 4-bet. Because if I have a hand like tens or ace, jack suited, I might want my opponent to call my 3-bet because I think ace-jack suited is strong enough, but I sure as heck don't want him to 4-bet. So again, just get comfortable with the fact that it's often best to raise, even though you rarely want to face the re-raise. All right, so let's do one more pre-flop example. So the cutoff opens, the button flats, and we have ace-10 suited in the small blind. What should we do? And of course, this isn't solvable, so it's kind of just going to be my opinion and your opinion. Well, it's not solvable, but I think we should squeeze. I really want to make other ace-10 off hands fold, and the cutoff can definitely have ace-10 off here, and even the button might have it. And I don't think our hand plays that well multi-way. So again, I'm obviously hoping the opponents have weaker hands which fall into their folding range. If they 4-bet, I'll deal with it. I'm probably going to fold, but maybe not. But as usual, I'm raising or betting and hoping for folds. I want my opponents to have the weakest hands that are in the weakest part of their range. Okay, so just, again, absorb that. All right, so let's do a post-flop example. So we open with ace-10 off on the button and the big blind 3-bets. We call. The flop comes 10-9-5 with a flush draw. The opponent bets 10 big blinds into an 18 big blind pot. I usually raise in this spot and hope my opponent folds. Okay, so that's what I'm usually going to do here. So now we have a couple questions. Question number 1. Does this raise make sense in theory, or is it an exploitative raise? Additionally, is it a value raise or a bluff raise? So pause for a moment and answer that question. Am I raising for value? Am I raising as a bluff raise? And is it exploitative or theoretical? And the answer is it makes sense in theory, I hope at least, and it's a value raise. This is the strongest hand I'm raising, and I'm raising some bluffs and draws too. But the reason why it's called a value raise is still overall if I'm raising on this flop with like ace-10 and some gut shots. And that might actually be my only raising range on this flop, like ace-10 and gut shots. That's still a polarized range. The good hand, the good high equity hand is ace-10, and then the robust low equity hand is the gut shot. That's a polarized range still overall. And since this is the better hand, it's the value raise. I'm okay with my raising range being capped as there isn't enough stack depth or streets left to act. So question number 2. Do I want my opponent to call, fold, or raise against my value raise? Pause for a moment and answer, but I'd most prefer him to fold, then I'd prefer him to call, then I'd prefer him to 3-bet. I want him to have a weak hand. I'm okay with him having a medium strength hand, and I don't want him to have a really, really strong hand or draw. And if he 3-bets, it's probably going to be a hand that, has me beat or a draw, or maybe a bluff if he could probably be bluffing sometimes too. But even his bluffs are probably going to be like draws, right? Like he might 3-bet bluff gut shots that he doesn't want to call with and all that kind of fun stuff. But yeah, I most prefer him to fold and then call than 3-bet. So then the next question is, why do I have a raising range if I want my opponent to fold when I'm value raising, right? Like, doesn't that seem weird to be raising for value but be like, please fold, please fold, please fold, even when I'm value raising? Because again, this might seem obvious when we're making the video, but you're probably used to on the flop. If your opponent c-bets and you raise the flop, you're usually going to be like raising the flop with like sets, 2-pair, and bluffs. When you're raising the flop, you're usually, if you're value raising, you're like, come on, call, 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 call. Or 3-bet, 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 3-bet against my flop raise. Whereas if you're bluffing on the flop, you're rooting for fold, 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 fold. But here I'm saying even our value raises are rooting for folds. So how does that make sense? Well, because I don't want to allow him to cheaply see free cards, and if my opponent folds, I win a pretty good sized pot. So that's why I'm raising. I'm raising because I don't want to just hand out free cards, and because if he folds, I'm going to win a pretty good sized pot. And as I already explained, he's going to have some hand that fits into some range. I'd rather have him have the weaker hand that just mucks rather than a stronger hand that calls or a stronger hand still that 3-bets. So question 4. If I hate facing a raise so much, if I hate facing my opponent's re-raise his 3-bet, why doesn't my opponent just raise me nonstop? Because I never want to see it. I never want to see that re-raise. Pause for a moment and answer it, but because my opponent only has so many hands in his range which can play effectively as raises. If he starts re-raising garbage, he'll get crushed. Also, just because I want him to fold does not mean my EV versus re-raise is 0, right? Because I'm not planning on mucking my ace-10 when he re-raises. If I did, then obviously I'd be super, super exploitable. So I think I can profitably play ace-10 versus re-raise. It's just not as profitable as I'm folding. Like if we go back and look, and you can pause for a moment and answer this if you want. If I re-raise and my opponent folds, what's my EV? And that might be kind of a hard question to ask the way I phrased it, but I would say it's 28 big blinds because there was an 18 big blind pot. My opponent bet 10 big blinds. If I re-raise and he mucks, I just win 28 big blinds. It's awesome. So my EV is 28 big blinds when he folds. So that would be, like here, if he folds, my EV is 28 big blinds. If he calls, I'm still going to have pretty good EV, but I don't think it's 28 big blinds in EV. And if he 3-bets, I'm still going to have an EV of greater than 0, I think, because I'm not just going to muck, but it's going to be a lot less than 28 big blinds in EV. So again, that's, I think, kind of a good way to look at it, which is like, if he folds, I win 28 big blinds. If he calls, I'm going to win less than that. And if he 3-bets, I'm going to win less than that still. So that's why I, of course, want him to fold, even though I'm value raising. So now we're just going to relax and we're going to kind of be a little bit of hippies and we're going to talk about our thoughts and our feelings about the hand. We're not going to be all analytical like we usually are. So, has everything I said so far make sense to you? This isn't provable stuff, so maybe I'm wrong and ace-10 shouldn't be raised here. The concepts still hold, though, and I wanted to pick an example that I thought was, close and interesting. Now, if you do agree with me that this is a flop raise, and you don't have to agree, just because I'm making a video doesn't mean I'm right, how would you feel if you raised the spot and your opponent put you all in with pocket jacks? And the turn came the king of diamond, making the board, 10, 9, 5 with the king, and you got stacked. How are you going to feel if that's the result? Because a lot of times people, I've analyzed this spot a lot in Flopzilla, to be honest, even though we're not talking about it right here. I have talked about it in another video, though. But a lot of, the advice you get is from people that have done stuff very trial and error-ish, which can work out pretty well if you get in that spot a lot. But the last spot's not going to be that common of an occurrence, so it helps to have really analyzed it because you're not going to just get a big enough sample to know for sure. So, what are your thoughts on this? If you were to have raised ace-10 here and you end up getting stacked by your opponent's pocket jacks and you would have gotten away from it if you would have called, how are you going to feel afterwards? Are you going to be results-oriented or are you still going to feel like you played the hand properly? So for seriously, get in touch with your feelings here. Are you going to be results-oriented and think, ugh, if I would have just called on the flop with ace-10, I wouldn't have gotten stacked. Next time, I'll just wait to see the turn and keep the pot smaller. Are you going to be results-oriented there if you get stacked when your opponent has pocket jacks? Or are you going to say, meh, I had 25% plus equity even when I'm behind. I don't really want to give free cards. And I think I'll either call or stack off with worse. Because remember, a lot of times we're going to raise on the flop and our opponent's either going to fold, in which case he didn't get to see free cards, or he's going to call, in which case we're probably going to have the best hand. For all I know, maybe calling is even better than our opponent folding because maybe our opponent will never call with better than ace-10. So it's really important when you're analyzing spots that you can't solve directly to sort of imagine winning, imagine losing, kind of see how you feel and try to prevent yourself from being results-oriented. Because what I'm advocating, which is getting yourself mentally trained to bet or raise for value, even when you want folds and really, really hate getting re-raised, you're not going to be able to implement that as long as you're being results-oriented. Because you're just always going to be like, oh, I'll just call because then I don't feel that bad. Whereas if you raise, then you face the 3-bet and end up getting stacked and you're results-oriented, it's going to bring leaks into your game because it's just going to be a bad feeling that you knew you could have gotten away from if you would have only called. So likewise, imagine if your opponent tanks versus your raise and then decides to go all in with his jack-10 or straight draw and he only has 33% equity and you win. Are you going to be results-oriented here? Because obviously if your opponent ends up 3-betting with his jack-10 or king-10, or, everyone's seen everything crazy before. Like your opponent might even stack off a random 9, or he ends up just jamming with a gut shot or something like that. You're probably going to feel awesome afterwards. But you don't want to be results-oriented. You want to really make sure you've thought it out, everything makes sense, you understand what you're doing. You're not being results-oriented because, again, you're just not going to get in these spots often enough where you're going to be able to be like, well, I've been in this spot 33 times. Even 33 times wouldn't be a big enough sample. You're not going to get in this spot 250 times where you can say, oh, I've done this spot enough. I have enough of a sample to know what is the more profitable line. You really have to just think, make sure everything makes sense, and then you can use the help of software to, make sure you're confident with your line. All right, so let's do hand example number 2. So let's say you open queen 3 suited in the button and the big blind calls. The flop comes queen 10-5 with a flush draw. Villain checks, you bet, and he calls. That seems pretty reasonable to me to c-bet on this flop. You're going to get called by a lot of 10s. Your opponent can have a lot of straight draws and gut shots. So it seems fine to bet this hand. Let's say the turn's an 8 of clubs. Villain checks, and you decide to check back. So this is fine to check the turn, I think. So again, You'll probably have some people that advocate betting the turn here. Betting the turn will be a plus EV line, but you have to think here. If you bet the turn, you're still losing to pretty much all queens in your opponent's range. But on top of that, your opponent might like muck some. He's going to probably muck some like tens or ace, maybe not tens, but he'll muck some like ace high hands, which called the flop. So you're not going to be getting more value from those hands. And if your opponent has like the offsuit jack 9 and 10-8 and 10-8 combos in his range, and he's going to be able to check raise those and check raise a bunch of bluffs to balance it. Maybe he doesn't check raise the 10-8, but at least check raise the jack 9. So one other thing that sucks about betting this turn is you can get blasted off the better hand by your opponent's check raise bluffs. In the case where he does have, jack 9 or pocket 8s or something like that. So be aware of that. So I think betting the flop and checking the turn is fine here. Let's say the river is the 4 of diamonds. Villain checks. Do you check or bet here? Well, my honest opinion is I think it's a bet. It's fine to go bet, check, bet sometimes, as this line gets value on the flop and prevents you from being check raised on the turn. Note villain may have 16 straight combos on the turn. And it's also, this line also allows your opponent to bluff on the river, and he might even bet large. But on top of that, your opponent might like muck some, he's going to probably muck some like tens or ace, maybe not tens, but he'll muck some like ace high hands, which called the flop. So you're not going to be getting more value from those hands. And if your opponent has like the offsuit jack 9 and 10-8 and 10-8 combos in his range, and he's going to be able to check raise those and check raise a bunch of bluffs to balance it. Maybe he doesn't check raise the 10-8, but at least check raise the jack 9. So one other thing that sucks about betting this turn is you can get blasted off the better hand by your opponent's check raise bluffs. In the case where he does have, jack 9 or pocket 8s or something like that. So be aware of that. So I think betting the flop and checking the turn is fine here. Let's say the river is the 4 of diamonds. Villain checks. Do you check or bet here? Well, my honest opinion is I think it's a bet. It's fine to go bet, check, bet sometimes, as this line gets value on the flop and prevents you from being check raised on the turn. Note villain may have 16 straight combos on the turn. And it's also, this line also allows your opponent to bluff on the river, and he might even bet large, and you can pick off his bluffs when this happens. So you have, top parity you can call. So on this river, if you go bet, check, bet, like let's look at this board texture. I think most people that are watching this would agree that this is a spot where sometimes you'll go bet, check, bet. But when you do this, you're pretty much going to have a capped range on the river. Because I don't think you would bet the flop with pocket 4s. So, and even queen 4 is still like sort of a capped hand on the river. It's, it's 2 pair, but it's not like the straight or anything like that. So on this river, we are going to have a capped range after going bet, check, bet. But that can still be okay. Now, if we go bet, check, bet here sometimes, queen 3, is this going to be a value bet or a bluff on the river? Well, clearly it's going to be a value bet. We're hoping our opponent calls with like a 10x hand or something like that. So it's clearly going to be a value bet. But every single hand we bet in our range on this river, even if we're betting queen 4, we do not want to see that river check raise because our range is capped. So, again, it's just a very common spot where we're value betting and we're just nothing in our range wants to see the re-raise. That doesn't mean we made a mistake, and you can't be afraid to bet rivers even if your range is capped sometimes. It's okay to bet 40 to 60% of the pot even though getting check raise sucks with any hand in our range because villain can't check raise all that often. If he's check raising super, super often, then he's either too weighted towards bluffs or he's checking too many strong hands on the river himself, in which case we'll just always check back. So again, it makes sense to go bet, check, bet here sometimes, even though we're always going to hate facing the re-raise. So this is just a spot where I've noticed, like sometimes I'll see people check back a queen here or something when I would have called on the river with a hand like 10x. And I'm like, oh, why didn't they just bet the river? I would think that that would be a hand they bet. So again, maybe, you don't need to always, it doesn't need to be just queen 3 here. Maybe you play a hand like queen 9 this way or queen 7 this way, a queen with a little bit of a better kicker so you can get value from, some of your opponent's weaker queens when he's in the big blind. But just be very comfortable with even on the river, you can bet a capped range. You're always going to hate facing a re-raise. It doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. So it turns out I'm struggling for hand examples now because usually making hand examples is pretty easy, but right now there are a few problems. The first is the leak of checking when one should bet or calling when one should raise is a common one, but different players usually struggle in different spots. So I don't want to show examples where 85% of viewers would get the spot right, because usually when I show a hand example to illustrate a concept, it's something like I think most people are going to be misplaying it or most people are going to be confused. Whereas here, even though this league exists, there's not like one really common spot I can think of, because most people just bet too much. So spots where it should be close between betting and checking, a lot of players are just going to auto bet. So again, I'm trying to showcase spots where you should bet, even though, you risk getting check raised, you don't really want to get called. This isn't necessarily a spot that a lot of people are struggling with on the flop, because instead people auto c-bet too much. So this makes it hard for me to use flop betting examples, which would probably be the clearest examples. So let's make things interesting. The following concepts will be discussed in more detail in future videos, but I'll introduce it now to really drive the point home of raising and really hoping not to get re-raised. This is the kind of stuff I'm working on right now. Again, concepts will be much more important here than the actual hand, since I want you to try to think of spots where you have this league that I didn't make a hand example for. So this right now is my favorite spot to think about. So this is my favorite spot to think about right now. You should write down combos for this rather than just watch the video. You'll only get to do it once for the first time. So your brain will remember stuff a lot better if you actually tried to do something and you got it wrong than if you just listen to me when I say something. So you only get one first crack at this, so I would recommend you really actually do it. So here we go. I open in the big blind for 2.25 big blinds in the button with a 45% button opening range, and you call in the big blind. You check to me, and I bet 50% of the pot on a 9-5-2 flop. Write down your flop check raising and check calling range. Seriously, if you want to improve, you should do it. So I know you're probably calling with a lot of hands in the big blind, but you probably never donk bet on that flop. So you should write down what hands you check raise and check call with. Or at least get out Flopzilla and sort of mark everything if you're not going to actually write it down, which is fine. So I think there are 3 common ranges, and this relates back to what I talked about at the beginning of the video. The first is range number 1, when you kind of check raise sets for value and then draws, which you consider to be bluffs, and you actually are check raising very few really weak hands. These are the kind of ranges people used to make a few years ago when I started coaching them. Just about everyone was much worse at poker than now, and these are the ranges people often come up with after reading basic poker books and not understanding bluffing to value raising ratios. So those ratios don't work perfectly, but you're going to need to check raise a lot of air hands very aggressively here to make your opponent sort of indifferent to calling with a lot of hands. And, a lot of players, if they haven't been explained that stuff, they just don't bluff. They don't understand you're supposed to bluff the flops much more aggressively than you bluff on the river. All right, so I doubt many of you came up with a range that's weighted towards value, as most of you are pretty good poker players by now with regards to, standards of 4 years ago. Again, this is the old range that I would expect most people to have. So the range that I imagine most of you made is a highly polarized range that I mostly advocate in videos. So you count the combos you're value check raising. So you have like probably 9 set combos. Let's say you have two pair of combos and then a few pretty kick-ass draws. And then you use about a 3-to-2 bluffing to value raising ratio since we're out of position. But here, even though that's our general rule of thumb, here we'll probably bluff a little bit more aggressively since our value check raises are just so strong. They're almost all sets, and the button's opening range and c-betting range is really weak here. So you can probably even bluff a little bit more aggressively here. So just making it up off the top of my head, let's say we raise 11 made hands for value, we check raise 6 or 7 draws, and then we check raise 23 to 25 bluffs or so. It's no big deal, but something like this. So don't at all try to get like some perfect number down. It doesn't exist, but somewhere in this neighborhood seems good. So let's keep going with this, and notice how effective this range is at letting us realize our equity. We check raise with hands with a very robust equity, like gut shots, through to flush, through to straight, etc., and our very strong hands. Our hands that are so strong that we don't really care if we make our opponent's range stronger, because this set's pretty much going to beat our opponent no matter what's in his range. This range turns just about every hand into our opponent's range into a bluff catcher and allows us to check raise and continue betting pretty aggressively. Of course, there's going to be some difference when our opponent holds a hand like pocket eights, for a pair of eights, and like pocket aces, because we're way more likely to outdraw our opponent's pocket eights than aces. So the term bluff catcher, again, doesn't work perfectly, but the general idea of like our polarized range makes our opponent have a lot of hands which are beating our bluffs and losing to our value check raises, and then may or may not, win at showdown against a draw, depending on if we get there. Okay, cool. I like this range a lot. I think it's a good range, and you'll get good results with it at most reasonable stakes. But we can go a bit deeper here. So now remember, you're in the big blind, and you're playing against me, and I'm on the button. So if you're check raising with nuts, air, draws, and I'm on the button, what's my counter strategy? So in other words, if I knew exactly what your range is, what would I do against it? So another thing I'm kind of just asking here is, if I know your range is sets, air, and draws, am I ever going to 3-bet you when I'm in position here, or am I just going to call? So think about it a little bit more. By 3-betting, I weaken my positional advantage significantly, and the reason for that is I give you a chance to 4-bet all in, which takes away my positional advantage completely. Or even if you call my 3-bet, I've lowered the stack depth, which makes position less valuable. So by 3-betting, I do that. And then I also want to say, do any hands in your range really hate facing a 3-bet? So is there any hand you check raise with on the flop that when you face a 3-bet, you're like, oh, what do you do? And then this just says what I just said. 3-betting reopens up the betting and allows you to go all in with a 4-betting range of nuts and draws. So it also lowers the stack depth, as I mentioned. So personally, I would not 3-bet against this range because I don't think there are any hands in your range which do poorly when facing a 3-bet. I'll just play in position and make decisions on future streets. Note this relates heavily with the concept SSNL, you're doing it wrong, part 1. More advanced players are fine with taking the more difficult lines that are more plus EV. Whereas players that are less comfortable are going to like snap 3-bet with like sets and draws, and sometimes even overpairs on the flop, even if it's not particularly effective against the check raising range, as this makes the hand easier to play. This also is probably, if you are in the big blind here, like we're assuming you are and I'm in the button, it also is what's in the past always tempted us to like check raise hands that do really well against a 3-bet. Because in reality, if we're playing against a lot of, non-perfect opponents that are making a lot of mistakes and they like to sort of 3-bet their draws and their sets in position, it encourages us to, 3-bet or to check raise the flop with a really polarized range because we don't want to check raise with a hand that hates seeing a 3-bet. If our opponent's going to 3-bet more than he should, then it's better to probably just emphasize check raising with hands that do pretty well against a 3-bet, such as draws, sets, and air. So now think about it a bit more. If you know I'm never 3-betting you on the flop after you check raise, do you have an incentive to start check raising some hands which are vulnerable to being 3-bet? Because again, this is how we usually kind of try to find out what we think is optimal-ish. We probably use some models, maybe some people use simulations, and then they use some math, and they try to get ranges or frequencies that look reasonable. And then from there, you think, how do you exploit those ranges or frequencies? And then you try to exploit someone that's exploiting you. And then he tries to exploit you back. And you go back and forth, and then you sort of, devise a strategy. And if you've gone back and forth enough, then hopefully you get close towards playing, optimal, where neither player has an incentive to change. So here I'm just saying, if you're check raising me with this super, super polarized range, I'm not going to 3-bet you. And then when I stop 3-betting you, now that maybe gives you an incentive to deviate your strategy and start check raising with some hands that play pretty well as check raises, even though they hate getting 3-bet. So maybe some ace-9 or king-9 combos will work there. And take it one step further. Imagine you're in the button. What are you doing usually on the flop with hands like king-queen, ace-10, king-jack, king-10, queen-10, jack-10, etc. when you face a flop check and then get check raised? Are you bet folding them? Because I'm guessing a lot of people open the button with a hand, let's say queen 10. They open the button and the flop comes 9-5-2 with a flush draw. They'll bet the flop, and then if they get check raised, they're just like, ew, I have king 10, I have queen 10. And especially if they have no backdoor flush draw, they just muck to the check raise. But I'm guessing even most people muck to the check raise even with the backdoor flush draw. And also think about what's being done with hands like queen 9, jack 9, 10 9. I bet these are the types of hands that most players, when they open the button with these hands, they get a 9-high flop, they'll c-bet it, and then if they get check raised, they'll call. So, again, absorb what I'm saying right now. We're going to analyze in more detail. But I'm saying, actually think about your own game. Don't try to think exactly what's optimal right now. But if you are on the button, are you betting this flop with a lot of hands that have, or at least some hands that have 2 overcards, and then folding them to a check raise? And likewise, are you betting the flop with a lot of hands that are weaker than king 9 and ace 9, but calling a check raise with them? Well, if the button is bet folding some hands with 2 overcards, bet calling with many pairs ace 9 has beat, and not 3-betting hands like queens and 10s all that often, then check raising ace 9 seems pretty good here. Even if, again, imagine you're in the big blind, so even if you hate seeing a 3-bet after you check raise ace 9 in the big blind, it just doesn't seem like you're getting 3-bet almost at all, and then when the opponent calls, he's often going to call with a hand ace 9 has beat. He's not going to 3-bet with the hands that you really don't want to get 3-bet by. And then if he does have two overcards, the opponent might just fold them sometimes. You know, he's probably not going to fold ace queen with a backdoor flush draw, but he'll probably fold some like queen 10 stuff. So this looks pretty effective here. So that brings us to the third range, which is using a less polarized check raising range. So it includes some ace-9 combos. Might even include some 6-6 type hands, but I'm not going to go into that there. But that would get into the less polarized check raising range in even more detail. So now, if we're check raising like some sets, some draws, some air hands, and some hands like ace-9 or king-9, now the opponent might want to 3-bet against our flop check raising range. Because if our opponent does have like a pair like 10s or jacks, those hands really, really want to 3-bet when we have ace-9. But they also don't really want to 3-bet when we have a set. So now you can see how there's becoming closer to an equilibrium, where now if the opponent has a hand like pocket jacks and we check raise him on the flop, he's like, he's not really sure whether he should 3-bet or call. Because on one hand, if he calls, he lets us see free cards. You know, we can very easily outdraw him, and he loses less value and he gets less value from our ace-9. And ace-9 also has a good amount of outs. It still has 5 outs against his jacks. But if he 3-bets them, then it lets us come all in over the top sometimes with sets and draws, which also makes the opponent's life really tough. So no, this is the most advanced range of the three. No, it's not solvable. I don't know if ace-9 is a check raise in theory for sure here from the big line. I don't know how many ace-9 or king-9 should be check raised here and how many should be called. It very likely is a mixed strategy, but I think some should be check raised, and we'll talk about why more in future videos. So what's my goal here? As mentioned earlier, this video seems a bit unorganized compared to my other videos, but here's what I want you to take from it. Non-professional players, begin understanding how we very regularly bet or raise with value hands and do not want action. Get comfortable with doing this and understand why it makes sense in theory. Don't be results oriented. So we're very often value betting, but the EV if our opponent folds is much higher than the EV if our opponent re-raises. So get comfortable with that. Professional players begin understanding how highly polarized ranges can likely be improved by adding some less polarized hands. This won't allow the opponent to recklessly raise against us. So just get more comfortable with this idea, I guess. It's one of those things, again, we're going to talk about this more in future videos, and it's just, I'm trying to look towards the future for what's probably going to be happening more as people get better with, you know, using polarized ranges and then making them a little bit less polarized. So what better way to examine this than asking 2+2's SSNL forums about this? So check out this thread I made a little while ago because I just wanted to see the responses. I made the thread tricky flop spot against a good reg, and I pretty much showed this exact spot. You'll notice, and I'll show you the thread in just a second, but you'll notice no one said the flop check raise is good, while most said it's bad. And my guess is most people watching this video were thinking, okay, cool, I buy the flop check raise with ace-9. You see why it's good, but are you still okay? Make sure when you're doing this, you're still okay with sometimes getting 3-bet on the flop, and don't let yourself become really results-oriented based on, you know, whether or not your opponent calls, folds, or 3-bets. All right, so I made a 45% button opening range, and this isn't, you know, you can use a different range, but whatever. This is the one that I just made. And I wanted to see how often ace-9's beat on the flop. Ace-9's only beat on the flop by an overpair or better 7% of the time. So keep that in mind that, like, you know, it's not that likely that ace-9 is beat here against the button opening range, and the button's probably c-betting very close to 100% of his range on this board texture. So because of that, ace-9's actually doing pretty well. Again, it's not like a nutted hand. You know, the opponent still has 7.5% flush draws, and you are beat 7% of the time. But also keep in mind, when you are beat, it's usually going to be like by jacks, queens, kings, or jacks, 10s, queens, or kings. And even ace-9 has a pretty good chance to outdraw those. So we're not beat here all that often. And here's the 2+2 thread I made, and you can already see the very first comment is, why did I check raise the flop when button opens, I call on the big line with ace-9, and then I check raise on a 9-6-3 flop, which is pretty much the same thing as what we had. That's a little different, but it's more or less the same flop that I was just using as the 9-5-2 example. So you can see that this assumed the pot was 950 on the flop, or about 5 big blinds. The button bet $6 or about 3 big blinds. We make a reasonable size check raise, and then the button 3-bets. Now, people are going to be like, if I were to have made this hand on 2+2, and I were to show myself like getting my check raise called and then a turn coming to 9 or an ace, no one would probably say anything about the flop check raise. But I think people, maybe a few people would, but I think people are super biased because, you know, when you get 3-bet on this flop, you're like, oh, you did not want to get 3-bet with ace-9. That's like the only hand I'm really check raising here where it's like, I don't know what to do. And by that, I don't mean I don't know what to do, but I mean you're going to have tough decisions. You're going to be confused. So this is like the only hand where that really happens, because if we had check raised a draw or, you know, a set or an error hand, our decision is pretty easy. So, I mean, you can look this up if you want and see what different people said, but most people were just like, don't check raise the flop. Where in reality, as I said, like the flop check raise is quite good here. And if you aren't check raising a hand like this on the flop, then I don't think Mr. Button's ever going to want to really 3-bet, because we just don't have any hands in our flop check raising range that a 3-bet's that effective against. All right, so try to begin applying this knowledge. Again, it's hard for me to make hand examples where I think most people are misplaying, since different people seem to misplay different spots. But pause for a moment and think, where are you taking a passive low variance line that has a lower EV than an aggressive line? Where are you letting your fear of getting re-raised cause you to play poorly? You can post hands in the hand analysis section or in this video thread and get feedback, but try to think of spots where you're actually, you know, making these misplays. You can take a higher EV, high variance line, but instead you're taking the passive one. Because as we just saw, it just sucks when you check raise like a weakish value hand and you get 3-bet, but it will happen sometimes. So now I want to go over where I think you should look based on your skill. Beginning players, you're probably taking way too passive of lines pre-flop. You're refusing to 3-bet or squeeze with hands like 10s, ace-jack, king-queen, ace-queen, ace-10 suited type hands, because getting 4-bet sucks, despite 3-betting being more profitable than calling. You know, it sucks to get 4-bet because if you fold, you just folded your awesome hand, and then if you get it in and you're behind, you're like, oh, you just stacked off 100 big blinds with pocket 10s. It's much easier mentally to just call, see a flop, and if you miss, you check fold. That doesn't feel bad. It just, you know, I think mentally it feels a lot better to like just be like, oh, my pocket 10s didn't flop a set, so I can fold. Whereas if you 3-bet it, you only invested, you know, I mean, you did invest more money pre-flop, but it's just so unsatisfying to 3-bet 10s and then have to fold it to a 4-bet. Yeah. So you're probably not taking these lines just because it feels crappy when it doesn't work out. Mentally accept your range rarely wants to face a re-raise. Stop designing ranges that always play super well versus re-raises. So again, if the button opens and I'm in the big blind, I'm 3-betting a really lot. But there's very few hands that when the button opens and I 3-bet, I'm actually like, come on, give me action. Come on, give me action. Come on, give me action. They're usually going to be like ace queen or better. And I mean, I'm 3-betting so many hands that are weaker than ace queen. Like I'm 3-betting hands like ace 10. And I mean, obviously with ace 10, I'm hoping I don't get action, even though ace 10 is a pretty good hand. So medium skilled players. You're probably too afraid of having a capped range and betting with it. Your opponent can only raise you so much and remain balanced. You probably don't raise flops aggressively enough in spots where giving free cards is very risky. And you're probably too afraid to make small flop or turn bets when getting check raise will give you a tough decision, despite the fact that betting will deny free cards or get you value. So just something to think about, just like a few general trends that are, you know, in some of the medium skilled players that I know. And almost every league that I list here is like a league I've had before. So it's not like I'm a stranger to these. But yeah, don't be too afraid to bet with a capped range. And remember, like, your opponent can only raise you so aggressively while remain balanced. So I think it's really easy to get scared and realize, like, oh my gosh, if he check raises and he's balanced, every single hand in my range has 0 EV. And that does seem scary, but he can only check raise so much and remain balanced. So it's often still correct to bet, even when every hand in your range will get turned into a bluff catcher. So mentally accept cap ranges are inevitable, as you are usually only 100 big blinds effective anyways. Your opponent can't magically make nutted hands. He's usually not packing too much heat, and letting him realize his equity is a big deal. So especially for 100 big blind poker, a lot of times it's not worth slow playing on a wet board because you can lose action or get outdrawn. So you don't slow play, and then you get a bad turn or river, and then you can face a big bet. Or if your opponent checks and you bet, you'll be betting with a capped range. That's inevitable for only 100 big blind stack poker because you just don't usually have an incentive to take really risky lines because there's not enough, stack depth where you can get paid. Like, you can't get paid off by taking a super risky line and catching like a massive 4 times pot size river shove or anything like that. So because of that, you're often going to have capped ranges. They can still be okay to bet. Don't worry about it. Don't bet recklessly, but don't be too afraid to bet. So for the more advanced players, your range is probably too polarized in certain spots, especially when you'll rarely face a re-raise. Remember, if you can't face a re-raise, you can get away with like check raising or just raising with hands that don't do well to the 3-bet because you're just not going to get 3-bet. This might result in you allowing your opponents to realize their equity too effectively, such as, when you have ace-9 on a 9-6-3 board. You might not be getting enough value early on against your opponent's pair of nines, and you might be letting him realize his equity with hands like queen 10 too cheaply. So that's probably a leak that a lot of the really good players have. And since your ranges are too polarized, you'll also have trouble balancing check calls on following streets after check raising the flop. Again, these concepts are hard and will be discussed in future videos. Just start absorbing the concept now for when we analyze ranges later. You will usually have at least some hands in your raising range which hate facing a re-raise. And this ties back into pre-flop. Like, I know I was a big advocate, as I think most people were, of people used to just not 3-bet pre-flop with hands that really did poorly against a 4-bet. Whereas now it's incredibly normal to do that. So it's the same thing post-flop. You're just going to be raising with hands that really don't want to face the re-raise and just deal with it when it happens. So start trying to absorb these concepts now. And then another thing, too, with regards to pre-flop is if you 3-bet too polarized of a range pre-flop, you probably are having trouble like check calling on certain board textures on like the flop or the turn. The same thing can happen if you're not like check raising hands like ace 9 or king 9 on this 9-6-3 board. You might have trouble like developing a check calling range on certain turn and river textures if you're never check raising like more vulnerable hands, more weaker and vulnerable hands. So just be aware of that it causes other things in your range to balance too. So start just entertaining the idea. So now we're at the end of the video. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. Hopefully, you'll now be more willing to bet or raise in spots even when getting re-raised sucks, and realize this doesn't suggest you're making a mistake. I also hope you'll have some new concepts to think about when designing ranges. Lastly, good luck. So that pretty much wraps up the video. Hopefully, everyone, regardless of their skill level, got something from this. I can answer questions in the forums. Don't recklessly bet, because I know that's a leak that a lot of small stake players and micro stakes players have. Again, that's not what this video is saying. It's saying more of understand that when you bet, you really, really rarely want to face a re-raise, and don't let that prevent you from betting, especially when betting will deny your opponent the ability to realize a lot of his, reasonably high equity hands. So thanks for watching, everyone. Good luck at the tables. Bye.